Hey people, today I have decided to read Emma by Jane Austen. And this time, this is a classical book, so I can read it out loud. So, this is my kind of experiment. So, let's see how it goes. And I cannot say that how many times I'm going to read. So, let's start with the first chapter of Emma. Chapter 1 Emma. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little or distress or vexation. She was the youngest of the two daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father and had, in consequences of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her cases, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as a governess, who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in Mr. Woodhouse's family, less as a governess than a friend, very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governance, the mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as a friend and friend very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. The real evils, indeed, of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. There were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present too unpursued that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. So came a gentle sorrow, but not at all in the shape of any disagreeable consequences. Miss Taylor married. It was Miss Taylor's loss which first brought grief. It was on the wedding day of this beloved friend that Emma first said in the mournful thought of any continuance. The wedding over, and the bride people gone. Her father and herself were left to dine together with no prospect of a third to cheer a long evening. Her father composed himself to sleep after dinner, as usual, and she had been then only to sit and think of what she had lost. The event had every promise of happiness for her friend. Mr. Weston was a man of unexceptionable characters, easy fortune, suitable age, and pleasant manners, and there was some satisfaction in considering with what self-denying, generous friendship she had always wished and promoted to match. But it was black morning's work for her. The want of Miss Taylor would be felt every hour of every day. She recalled her past kindness, the affection of 16 years, how she had taught and how she had played with her from 5 years old, how she had devoted all her powers to attach and amuse her in health, and how nursed her through the various illness of childhood. A large debt of gratitude was owing here, but the intercourse of the last 7 years, the equal footing and perfect unserved which had soon followed Isabel's marriage, to on them being left to each other, was yet a dearer, tenderer recollection. She had been a friend and companion, such as few possessed. intelligent, well informed, useful, gentle, knowing all the ways of the family, interested in all its concerns, and peculiarly interested in herself, in every pleasure, every scheme of hers, one to whom she could speak every thought as it arose, and who had such an affection for her as could never find fault. How was she to bear the change? It was true that her friend was going only half a mile from them. But Emma was aware that great must be the difference between a Mrs. Weston, only half a mile from them, and a Miss Taylor in the house, and with all her advantages, natural and domestic, she was now in great danger of suffering from intellectual solitude. She dearly loved her father, but he was no companion for her. He could not meet her in conversations, rational or playful. The evil of the actual disparity in their age, and Mr. Woodhouse had not married early, was much increased by his constitution and habits. For having been a valedictorian all his life without activity of mind or body, he was a much older man in ways than in years, and though everywhere beloved for the friendliness of his heart and his amiable temper, his talent could not have recommended him at any time. Her sister, though comparatively but little removed by matrimony being settled in London, only 16 miles off, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long October and November evening must be struggled through at Hartfield. Before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabel and her husband and the little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again. Highbury, the large and populous village, almost amounting to a town, to which Hartfield, in spite of its separate lawn and shrubberies and name, it really belonged, afforded her no equals. The Woodhouses were first in consequences there. All looked up to them. She had many acquaintances in the place, for her father was universally civil, but not one among them who could be accepted in lieu of Miss Taylor for even half a day. Highbury, the large soon. It was a melancholy change, and Emma could not but sigh over it and wish for impossible things. Still, her father awoke and made it necessary to be cheerful. His spirits required support. He was a nervous man, easily depressed, fond of very body, fond of everybody that he was used to, and hating to part with them, hating change of every kind, matrimony as the origin of change, was always disagreeable, and he was by no means yet reconciled to his own daughter's marrying, nor could ever speak of her but with compassion, though it had been entirely a match of affection. When he was now obliged to part with Miss Taylor too, and from his habits of gentle selfishness and of being never able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself. He was very much disposed to think Miss Taylor had done as said a thing for herself as for them, and would have been a great deal happier if she had spent all the rest of her life at Hartfield. Emma smiled and chatted as cheerfully as she could to keep him from such thoughts, but when tea came, it was impossible for him not to say exactly as he had said at dinner. Poor Miss Taylor. I wish she was here again. What a pity it is that Mr. Weston ever thought of her. I cannot agree with you, Papa. You know I cannot. Mr. Weston is such a good humored, pleasant, excellent man that he thoroughly deserves a good wife. And you would not have had Miss Taylor live with us forever. And be all my odd humors when she might have a house of her own. A house of her own? But where is the advantage of a house of her own? This is three times as large, and you have never any odd humors, my dear. How often we shall be going to see them, and they coming to see us? We shall be always meeting. We must go and pay wedding visit to very soon. My dear, how am I to get so far? Vandals is such a distance. I could not walk half so far. No, Papa, nobody thought of your walking. We must go in the carriage, to be sure. The carriage, but James will not like to put the horses to for such a little way. And where are the poor horses to be while we are paying our visits? They are to be put into Mr. Weston's stable, Papa. You know, we have settled all that already. We talked it all over with Mr. Weston last time. And as for James, you may be very sure he will always like going to London's because of his daughters being housemaid there. I only doubt whether he will ever take us anywhere else. That was your doing, Papa. You got Hannah that good place. Nobody thought of Hannah till you mentioned her. James is so obliged to you. I'm very glad I did think of her. It was very lucky, for I would not have had poor James think himself slighted upon any account, and I'm sure she will make a very good servant. She is a civil, pretty spoken girl. I'm sure she will make a very good servant. She's a civil, pretty spoken girl. I have a great opinion of her. Whenever I see her, she always curtsies and asks me how I do in a very pretty manner. And when you have had her here to do needlework, I observe she always turns the lock of the door the right way and never bangs it. I'm sure she will be an excellent servant, and it will be a great comfort to poor Miss Taylor to have somebody about her that she is used to see. Whenever James goes over to see his daughter, you know she will be hearing of us. He will be able to tell her how we all are. I must spare no exertions to maintain this happy flow of ideas and hope with the help of backgammons to get her father tolerably through the evening and be echoed by no regrets but her own. The backgammon table was placed, but our visitor immediately afterwards walked in and made it unnecessary. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man about 7 or 8 and 30, was not only a very old and intimate friend of the family, but particularly connected with it as the elder brother of Isabel's husband. He lived about a mile from Highbury, was a frequent visitor and always welcome, and at this time more welcome than usual as coming directly from the mutual connection in London. He had returned to a late dinner after some days' absence and now walked up to Hartfield to say that all were well in Brunswick Square. It was a happy circumstance and animated Mr. Woodhouse for some time. Mr. Knightley had a cheerful manner which always did him good, and his many inquiries after poor Isabel and her children were answered most satisfactorily. When this was over, Mr. Woodhouse gratefully observed, "It is very kind of you, Mr. Knightley, to come out at this late hour to call upon us. I am afraid you must have had a shocking walk." Not at all, sir. It is a beautiful moonlight night and so mild that I must draw back from your great fire. But you must have found it very damp and dirty. I wish you may not catch cold. Dirty, sir. Look at my shoes, not a speck of them. Well, that is quietly surprising, for we had a vast deal of rain here. It rained dreadfully hard for half an hour while we were at breakfast. I wanted them to put off the wedding. By the by, I have not wished you joy, being pretty well aware of what sort of joy you must both be feeling. I have been in no hurry with my congratulations, but I hope it all went off tolerably well. How did you all behave? Who cried most? Ah, poor Miss Taylor. Ties side business. Poor Mr. and Miss Woodhouse, if you please, but I cannot possibly say poor Miss Taylor. I have a great regard for you and Emma. But when it comes to the questions of dependence or independence, at any rate, it must be better to have only one to please than two. Especially when one of those two is such a faithful, troublesome creature, said Emma playfully. That is what you have in your mind. I know, and what you would certainly say if my father were not by. I believe it is very true, my dear indeed, said Mr. Woodhouse with a sigh. I'm afraid I am sometimes very fanciful and troublesome. My dearest papa, you do not think I could mean you? Oh, it was Mr. Knightley to mean you? What a horrible idea. Oh, no, I meant only myself. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me. You know, in a joke, it is all a joke. We always say what we like to one another. Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them, and though this was not particularly agreeable to Emma herself, she knew it would be so much less to see her father that she would not have him really suspect such circumstances as her not being thoughtful perfect by every day. Emma knows I never flatter her, said Mr. Knightley, but I meant it no reflection on anybody. Miss Taylor had been used to have two persons to please. She will not have but one. The chances are that she must be a gainer. Well, said Emma, willing to let it pass, you want to hear about the wedding, and I shall be happy to tell you, for we all behaved charmingly. Everybody was punctual, everybody in their best looks, not a tear, and hardly a long face to be seen. Ah, no, we all felt that we were going to be only half a mile apart, and were sure of meeting every day. Dear Emma, dears, everything so well, said the father. But Mr. Knightley, she is really sorry to lose poor Miss Taylor, and I'm sure she will miss her more than she thinks for. Emma turned away, her head divided between tears and smiles. It is impossible that Emma should not miss such a companion, said Mr. Knightley. We should not like her so well as we do. Sir, if we could suppose it, but she knows how much the marriage is to Miss Taylor's advantage. She knows how very acceptable it must be at Miss Taylor's time of life to be settled in a home full of her own, and how important to her to be secure of a comfortable provision, and therefore cannot allow herself to feel so much pain as pleasure. Every friend of Miss Taylor must be glad to have so happily married. You have forgotten one matter of joy to me, said Emma, and a very considerable one, that I made the match myself. I made the match, 4 years ago, and to have it take place and be proved in the right when so many people said Mr. Weston would never marry again. May comfort me for anything. Mr. Knightley shook his head at her. Her father fondly whispered, Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things. For whatever you say always comes to pass. Please do not make any more matches. I promise you to make none for myself, Papa, but I must indeed for other people. It is the greatest amusement in the world, and after such success, everybody said that Mr. Weston would never marry again. Oh dear, no, Mr. Weston, who had been a widower so long and who seemed so perfectly comfortable without a wife, so constantly occupied either in his business in town or among his friends here, always acceptable wherever he wants, always cheerful. Mr. Weston need not spend a single evening in the year alone if he did not like it. Oh no, Mr. Weston certainly would never marry again. Some people even talked of a promise to his wife on her deathbed, and others of the son and the uncles, not letting him. All manner of solemn nonsense was talked on the subject. But I believed none of it. Ever since the day, about 4 years ago, that Miss Taylor and I met with him in Broadway Line. When, because it began so dismal, he darted away with so much gallantry and brought two umbrellas for us from Farmer Michael's. I made up my mind on the subject. I planned the match from the hour. And when the success has blessed me in this instance, dear Papa, you cannot think that I shall leave off matchmaking. I do not understand what you mean by success, said Mr. Knightley. Success suppose endure. Your time has been properly and delicately spent. If you have been enduring for the last 4 years to bring about this marriage, a worthy employment for a young lady's mind. But if, which I rather imagine, you're making the match, as you call it, means only you're planning it. You're saying to yourself one idle day, I think it would be a very good thing for Miss Taylor if Mr. Weston were to marry her, and saying it again to yourself every now and then afterwards. Why do you talk of success? Where is your merit? What are you proud of? You made a lucky guess, and that can be said. And have you never known the pleasure and triumph of a lucky guess? I pity you. I thought you cleverer, for depend upon it is a lucky guess is never merely luck. There is always some talent in it. And as to my poor word success, which you quarreled with, I do not know that I am so entirely without any claims to it. You have drawn two pretty pictures, but I think there may be a third, something between the do nothing and do all. If I had not promoted Mr. Weston's visit here and given many little encouragements and smoothed many little matters, it might not have come to anything after all. I think you must know Hartfield enough to comprehend that a straightforward, open-hearted man like Weston and a rational, unaffected woman like Miss Taylor may be safely left to manage their own concerns. You are more likely to have done harm to yourself than good to them by interference. Emma never thinks of herself if she can do good to others, rejoined Mr. Woodhouse, understanding but in part. But my dear, pray do not make any more matches. There are silly things and break up one's family circle grievously. Only one more, Papa. Only for Mr. Elton. Mr. Elton, you like Mr. Elton, Papa? I must look about for a wife for him. There is nobody in Highbury who deserves him, and he has been here over a year and has fitted up his house so comfortably that it would be a shame to have him single any longer. And I thought, when he was shown in the hands today, he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind of office done for him. I think very well of Mr. Alton, and this is the only way I have of doing him a service. Mr. Alton is a very pretty young man, to be sure, and a very good young man. I have great regard for him. But if you want to show him any attention, my dear, ask him to come and dine with us someday. That will be a much better thing. I dare say Mr. Knightley will be so kind as to meet him with a great deal of pleasure, sir, at any time, said Mr. Knightley, laughing. And I agree with you entirely that it will be a much better thing and invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife. Depend upon it, a man of 6 or 7 and 20 can take care of himself. Chapter 2. Mr. Weston was a native of Highbury and born of a respectable family, which for the last 2 or 3 generations had been rising into gentility and property. He had received a good education, but on succeeding early in life to a small independence, had become indisposed for any of the more homely pursuit in which his brothers were engaged, and had satisfied an active, cheerful mind and social temper by entering into the militia of his country, then embodied it. Captain Weston was a general favorite, and when the chance of his military life had introduced him to Miss Churchill of a great Yorkshire family, and Miss Churchill fell in love with him, nobody was surprised except her brother and his wife. Wu had never seen him, and Wu were full of pride and importance, which the conjunctions would offend. Miss Churchill, however, being of age and with the full command of her fortune, though her fortune bore no proportion to the family estate, was not to be dissuaded from the marriage, and it took place to the infinite mortification of Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, who threw her off with due decorum. It was an unsuitable connection and did not produce much happiness. Mrs. Weston ought to have found more in it, for she had a husband whose warm heart and sweet temper made him think everything due to her in return for the great goodness of being in love with him. But though she had one sort of spirit, she had not the best. She had resolutions enough to pursue her own will in spite of her brother, but not enough to refrain from unreasonable regrets at that brother's unreasonable anger, nor from missing the luxuries of her former house. They lived beyond their income, but still it was nothing in comparison of in scope. She did not cease to love her husband, but she wanted to wants to be the wife of Captain Weston and Mr. Churchill of Enscope. Captain Weston, who had been considered especially by the Churchills as making such an amazing match, was proved to have much the worst of the bargains, for when his wife died after a 3 years' marriage, he was rather a poor man than at first, and with a child to maintain. From the expense of the child, however, he was soon relieved. The boy had, with the additional softening claim of a lingering illness of his mother's, been the means of a sort of reconciliation, and Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, having no children of their own, nor any other young creature of equal kind to care for, offered to take the full charge of the little Frank soon after her decease. Some scruples and some reluctance the widower father may be supposed to have felt, but as they were overcome by other considerations, the child was given up to the care and the wealth of the churches, and he had only his own comfort to seek and his own situation to improve as he could a complete change of life become desirable. He quieted the militia and engaged in trade, having brothers already established in a good way in London, which offered him a favorable opening. It was concerns which brought just employment enough. He had still a small house in Highbury, where most of his leisure days were spent, and between useful occupations and the pleasant of society, the next 18 or 20 years of his life passed cheerfully away. He had by the time realized an easy competence enough to secure the purchase of a little estate adjoining Highbury which he had always longed for. Enough to marry a woman as portionless even as Miss Taylor and to live according to the wishes of his own friendly and social disposition. It was now some time since Miss Taylor had begun to influence his schemes, but as it was not the tyrannic influence of youth on youth, it had not second his determinations of never settling till he could purchase Rendals. And the scale of Rendals was and the sale of Rendals was long looked forward to. But he had gone steadily on with these objects in view till they were accompanied. He had made his fortune, bought his house, and obtained his wife, and was beginning a new period of existence with every probability of greater happiness than in any yet passed through. He had never been an unhappy man. His own temper had secured him from that even in his first marriage. But his second must show him how delightful a well judging and truly amiable woman could be, and must give him the pleasantest proof of its being a great deal better to choose than to be chosen, to exist to excite gratitude than to feel it. He had only himself to please in his choices. His fortune was his own, for as to Frank it was more than being tactically brought up as his uncle's heir. It had become so avoided an adaptation as to have him assume the name of Churchill on coming of age. It was most unlikely, therefore, that he should ever want his father's assistance. His father had no apprehensions of it. The aunt was a capricious woman and governed her husband entirely. But it was not in Mr. Weston's nature to imagine that any caprice could be strong enough to affect one so dear and, as he believed, so deserved dearly. He saw his son every year in London and was proud of him, and his fond report of him as a very fine young man had made Highbury feel a sort of pride in him too. He was looked on as sufficiently belonging to the place to make his matrix and prospect a kind of a common concerns. Mr. Frank Churchill was one of the boast of Highbury, and a lively curiosity to see him prevailed through the compliment was so little definite that he had never been there in his life. His coming to visit his father had been often talked of but never advised, never achieved. Now, upon his father's marriage, it was very generally proposed as a most proper attention that the visit should take place. There was not a dissentient voice on the subject either when Mrs. Perry joined tea with Mrs. and Miss Pats, or when Mrs. and Miss Pats returned the visit. Now was the time for Mr. Frank Churchill to come among them, and the hope strengthened when it was understood that he had written to his new mother on the occasion. For a few days, every morning visit in Highbury included some mention of the handsome letter Mrs. Weston had received. I suppose you have heard of the handsome letter Mr. Frank Churchill has written to Mrs. Weston. I understand it was a very handsome letter indeed. Mr. Woodhouse told me of it. Mr. Woodhouse saw the letter, and he says he never saw such a handsome letter in his entire life. It was indeed a highly prized letter. Mrs. Weston had, of course, formed a very favorable idea of the young man, and such a pleasing attention was an irresistible proof of his great good sense, and a most welcome addition to every source and every expression of congratulation which her marriage had already secured. She felt herself a most fortunate woman, and she had lived long enough to know how fortunate she might well be, thought, where the only regret was for a partial separation from friends whose friendship for her had never cooled and who could ill bear to part with her. She knew that at times she must be missed, and could not think without pain of Emma's losing a single pleasure or suffering an hour's ennui from the want of her companionable, but dear Emma was of no feeble character. She was more equal to her situations than most girls would have been, and had sense and energy and spirits that might be hoped would bear her well and happily through its little difficulties and privations. And then there was such comfort in the very easy distance of Flanders from Hartwell, so convenient for even solitary female walking, and in Mr. Weston's disposition and circumstances which would make the approaching season no hindrance to their spending half the evening in the week together. The situation was not altogether the subject of hours of gratitude to Mrs. Weston and of moments only of regret. And her satisfaction, more than satisfaction, her cheerful enjoyment was so just and so apparent that Emma, well, as she knew her father, was sometimes taken by surprise at his being still able to pity poor Miss Taylor when they felt her at Randall's in the center of every domestic comfort, or saw her go away in the evening attended by her pleasant husband to a carriage of her own. But never did she go without Mr. Woodhouse's giving a gentle sign and saying, "Ah, poor Miss Taylor, she would be very glad to say." There was no recovering Miss Taylor, nor much likelihood of ceasing to pity her, but a few weeks brought some elevations to Mr. Woodhouse. The compliments of his neighbors were over. He was no longer teased by being wished joy of so sorrowful an event, and the wedding cake, which had been a great distress to him, was all eat up. His own stomach could bear nothing rich, and he could never believe other people to be different from himself. What was unwholesome to him he regarded as unfit for anybody, and he had therefore earnestly tried to dissuade them from having any wedding cake at all when that proved vain as earnestly tried to prevent anybody's eating. He had been at the pains of consulting Mr. Pay, the apothecary, on the subject. Mr. Perry was an intelligent, gentlemanlike man whose frequent visits were one of the comforts of Mr. Woodhouse's life, and upon being applied to, he could not but acknowledge, though it seemed rather against the bias of institutions, that wedding cake might certainly disagree with many, perhaps with most people, unless taken moderately with such an opinion in confirmation of his own. Mr. Woodhouse hoped to influence every visitor of the newly married pair, but still the cake was eaten, and there was no rest for his benevolent nerve till it was all gone. There was a strange humor in Highbury of all the time, all the little Perrys being seen with a slice of Mrs. Weston's wedding cake in their hands, but Mr. Woodhouse would never believe it. I have finished just two chapters. Let's see. The third chapter, chapter 3. Mr. Woodhouse was fond of a society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him, and for various united causes, from his long residence at Hartfield and his good nature, from his fortune, his home, and his total, he could command the visit of his own little circle in a great measure. As he liked, he had not much intercourse with any families beyond that circle. His horror of late hours and large dinner parties made him unfit for any acquaintance but such as would visit him on his own terms. Fortunately for him, Highbury includes Randalls in the same parish and Donwell Abbey in the parish adjoining the seat of Mr. Knightley, comprehended many such, not unfrequently through Emma's persuasion. He had some of the chosen and the best to dine with him, but evening parties were what he preferred, and unless he fancied himself at any time unequal to company, there was scarcely an evening in the week in which Emma could not make up a card table for him. Real long-standing regard brought to Weston and Mr. Knightley, and by Mr. Weston, a young man living alone without liking it, the privilege of exchanging any vacant evening of his own blank solitude for the elegancies and society of Mr. Woodhouse's drawing room, and the smile of his lovely daughter was in no danger of being thrown away. After this came a second set, among the most commendable of whom were Mrs. and Miss Betts and Mrs. Collard. Three ladies almost always at the service of invitations from Hartfield, and who were fetched and carried home so often that Mr. Woodhouse thought it no hardship for either James or the horses, had it taken place only once a year. it would have been a grievance. Mrs. Betts, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, was a very old lady, almost past everything but tea and quiet. She lived with her single daughter in a very small way and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady under such untoward circumstances can exist. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman, neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Miss Pat stood in the very worst predicament in the world for having much of the public favor, and she had no intellectual superior to make a monument to herself or frighten those who might had her into outward respect. She had never posted either beauty or cleverness. Her youth had passed without distinction, and the middle of his life was devoted to the care of a failing mother and the endeavor to make a small income go as far as possible. And yet, she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature and surrounded with blessings in such an excellent mother, and so many good neighbors and friends, and a home that wanted for nothing. The simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, a content and grateful spirit were a recommendations to everybody and a mind of felicity to herself. She was a great talker upon little matters, which exactly suited Mr. Woodhouse, full of trivial communications and harmless gossips. Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, not of a seminary or an establishment or anything which professed in long sentences of refined nonsense to combine liberal requirements with elegant morality upon new principles and new systems, and where young ladies for enormous pay might be screwed out of health and into vanity, but a real honest old-fashioned boarding school where a reasonable quantity of accomplishment were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls might be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies. Mrs. Goddard's school was in high repute, and very deservedly, for Highbury was become a particularly healthy sport. She had an ample house and garden, gave the children plenty of wholesome food, let them run about a great deal in the summer, and in winter dressed their chilblains with her own hands. It was no wonder that a train of 20 young couple now walked after her to church. She was a plain, motherly kind of woman who had worked hard in her youth and now thought herself entitled to the occasional holiday of a tea visit, and having formerly owed much to Mr. Woodhouse's kindness, felt his particular claim on to leave a neat parlour, hung round with fancy wood whenever she could, and win or lose a few sixpennies by the fireside. These were the ladies whom Emma found herself very frequently able to collect, and happy she was for her father's sake in the power, though as far as she was herself concerned, it was no remedy for the absence of Mrs. Weston. She was delighted to see her father look comfortable and very much pleased with herself for continuing things so well, but the quiet prosings of three such women made her feel that every evening so spent was indeed one of the long evenings she had fearfully anticipated. As is yet one morning, looking forward to exactly such a close of a pleasant day, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard, requesting in most respectful terms to be allowed to bring Miss Smith with her. A most welcome request. For Miss Smith was a girl of 17 whom Emma knew very well by sight and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. A very gracious invitation was returned, and The evening no longer dictated by the fair mistress of the mansion. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had splashed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of polar boarded. This was all that was generally known of her history. She had no visible friends but what had been acquired at Highbury and was now just returned from a long visit in the country to some young ladies who had been at school there with her. She was a very pretty girl, and her beauty happened to be of sort which Emma particularly admired. She was short, plump, and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of a great sweetness. And before the end of the evening, Emma was as much pleased with her manners as her as a person, and quite determined to continue the acquaintance. She was not struck by anything remarkably clever in Miss Smith's conversations. She was not, but she found her altogether with engaging, not inconveniently shy, not unwilling to talk, and yet so far from pushing, so, so proper, and shy, not unwilling to talk, and yet so far from pushing, becoming a difference, seeming to pleasantly grateful for being admitted to Hartfield, and so artlessly impressed by the appearance of everything in so superior a style to what she had been used to, that she must have good sense, and this of encouragement. Encouragement should be given, and those soft blue eyes and all those natural graces should not be wasted on the inferior society of Highbury on its connection. The acquaintance she had already formed were unworthy of herself. The friend whom the friend from whom she had just parted, two very good sort of people must be doing her harm. They were a family of the name of Martin, whom Emma well knew by characters as renting a large farm of Mr. Knightley and residing in the parish of Tonwell. Very creditably, she believed she knew Mr. Knightley too highly of them, but they must be coarse and unpolished and very unfit to be the intimate of a girl who wanted only a little more knowledge and elegance to be quite perfect. She would notice her, she would improve her, she would detach her from her bad acquaintance and introduce her into good society. She would, from her opinions and her manners, it would be an interesting and certainly a very kind undertaking, highly becoming her own situation in her life, her leisure and powers. She was so busy and admiring those soft blue eyes in talking and listening and forming all the skills in the in-betweens that evening flew away at a very unusual rate, and the super table, which always closed at parties and for which she had been used to sit and watch the due time, was all set out and ready and moved forward to the fire. Before she was aware, with an anxiety beyond the common impulse of a spirit which yet was never indifferent to the credit of doing everything well and attentively, with the real good will of mind delighted with its own ideas. Did she then do all the honors of the meal and help and recommended the minced chicken and scalloped oyster with an urgency that determined this scene would be acceptable to the early hours and civil scruples of their guests. Upon such occasions, poor Mr. Woodhouse's feelings were in sad warfare. He loved to have the cloth laid, because it had been the fashion of his youth, but his conviction of suppers being very unwholesome made him rather sorry to see anything put on it. And while his hospitality would have welcomed his visitors to everything, his care for the health made him grievous that they would sit. Such another small passion of thin gruel as his own was all that he could, with thought of self approbations recommended too. He might constrain himself while while the ladies were uncomfortably clearing the nicer things to say. Mrs. Bax, let me propose you venturing on one of these eggs. An egg boiled, very soft and not unwholesome. Sadly, understanding boiling an egg better than anybody, I would not recommend an egg boiled by anybody else, but you need not be afraid. They are very small. You see, one of our eggs will not hurt you. Miss Bats, let Emma help you a little bit of tart. A very little bit. Ours are all apple tarts. You need not be afraid of unwholesome preserves here. I do not advise the custard. Mrs. Kudas, what you say of a glass of wine? A small glass. Put it to a tumbler of water. I do not think it could distress with you. Emma allowed her father to talk, but supplied her visitors in a much more satisfactory style, and on the present evening had particular pleasure in sending them away happy. The happiness of Miss Smith was quite equal to her intentions. Miss Woodhouse was so great a personage in Highbury that the prospect of the introduction had given as much panic as pleasure. But the humble, grateful little girl went off with highly gratified feelings, delighted with the affability with which Miss Woodhouse had treated her all the evening, and actually second hands with her at last. Chapter 4. Harriet Smith's intimacy at Hartfield was soon a settled thing. Quick and decided in her ways, Emma lost no time in inviting, encouraging, and telling her to come very often. And as their acquaintance increased, so did the satisfaction in each other. As a walking companion, Emma had very early foreseen how useful she might find her. In that respect, Mrs. Weston Lowes had been important. Her father never went beyond the subway, where two divisions of the ground sufficed him for his long walk. Oh, he's short as the year varied, and since Mrs. Weston managed her exercise had been too much confined. She had ventured once alone to Randalls, but it was not pleasant, and Harriet Smith, therefore, on whom she could summon at any time to a walk would be a valuable addition to her privileges. But in every respect, as she saw more of her, she approved her and was confirmed in all her kind designs. Harriet certainly was not clever, but she had a sweet, docile, grateful dispositions, was totally free from conceit, and only desiring to be guided by any one she looked up to. Her early attachment to herself was very amiable, and her inclinations for good company and power of appreciation was what was elegant and clever, showed that there was no want of taste, though strength of understanding must not be expected. Altogether, she was quite convinced of Harriet Smith's being exactly the young friend she wanted, exactly the something which her home required. Such a friend as Mrs. Weston was out of the question. Two such could never be granted. Two such she did not want. It was quite a different sort of thing. A sentiment distinct and independent. Mrs. Weston was the object of regard which had its basis in gratitude and esteem. Harriet would be loved as one to whom she could be first attempts at analysis were an endeavor to find out who were the presents, but Harriet could not tell. She was ready to tell everything in her power, but on the subject questions were when Emma was obliged to fancy what she liked, but she could never believe that in the same situation she could not have discovered the truth. Harriet had not penetrations. She had been satisfied to hear and believe just what Mrs. Goddard chose to tell her, and looked to father. Mrs. Goddard's and the teachers and the girls and the affairs of the school in general formed naturally a great part of the conversations. And but for her acquaintance with the matrons of Abbey, Mill Farms, it must have been the world. But the Martins occupied her thoughts a good deal. She had spent 2 years 2 months with them, and now loved to talk the pleasures of her visit and describe the many comforts and wonders of the place. Emma encouraged her talkativeness, amused by such picture of another set of things, and enjoying the youthful simplicity which could speak with so much explanations of Mrs. Martin's having two parlors, two very good parlours indeed, one of them quite as large as Mrs. Goddard's drawing room, and of her having an upper maid who had lived 5 and 20 with her, and of the having 8 cows, two of them Edelweins and one a little Welsh cow, a very pretty little Welsh now indeed, and of Mrs. Martin saying as she was so fond of it, it should be called her cows, and of the having a very handsome summer house in the garden, where someday next year they were all to drink tea. A very handsome summer house, large enough to hold a dozen people. For some time she was amused, without thinking beyond the immediate cause. But as she came to understand the family better, other feelings arose. She had taken up a wrong idea, fancying it was a mother and daughter, a son and son's wife, who all lived together. But when it appeared that the Master Martin, who bore a part in the narrative and was always mentioned with approbations for his great good nature in doing something or other, was a single man, that there was no young Mrs. Martin, no wife in the case, she did suspect danger to her poor little friend from all this hospitality and kindness, and that if she were not taken care of, she might be required to sink herself forever. With these inspiring notions, the questions increased in numbers and meanings, and she particularly led Harriet to talk more of Mr. Martin, and there was evidently no dislike to it. Harriet was very ready to speak of the share he had had in the moonlight walks and merry evening games, and dwelt a good deal upon his being so very good humoured and obliged. He had gone 3 miles round one day in order to bring her some walnuts, because because she had said how fond she was of them, and in everything else he was so very obliged. He had his shepherd's son into the parlour one night on purpose to sing to her. She was very fond of singing. He could sing a little himself. She believed he was very clever and understood everything. She believed he was very clever and understood everything. He had a very fine flock, and while she was with them, he had been bid more for his wool than anybody in the country. She believed everybody speak well of him. His mother and sisters were very fond of him. Mrs. Martin had told her one day, and there was a blush as she said it. Mrs. Martin had told her one day that it was impossible for anybody to be a better son, and therefore she was sure whenever he married, he would make a good husband. Not that she wanted him to marry, she was in no hurry at all. Well done, Mrs. Martin, thought Emma. You know what you are about. And when she had come away, Mrs. Martin was so very kind as to send Mrs. Goddard a beautiful goose, the finest goose Mrs. Goddard had ever seen. Mrs. Goddard had dressed it on a Sunday and asked all the three teachers, Miss Nash and Miss Prince and Miss Richardson, to sup her with. Mr. Martin, I suppose, is not a man of importance beyond the line of his own business. He does not read. Oh, yes, that is no, I do not know, but I believe he has read good deal. But not what you were to think anything of. He reads the agriculture reports and some other books that lay in one of the window seats. But he reads all them to himself. But sometimes of an evening before we went to cards, he would read something aloud out of the elegant extract. Very entertaining. And I know he has read The Vicar of Wakefield. He never read The Romance of the Forest, nor The Children of the Abbey. He had never heard of such books before I mentioned them. But he is determined to get them now as soon as ever he can. The next question was, what sort of looking man is Mr. Marty? Ah, not handsome, not at all handsome. I thought him very plain at first, but I do not think him so plain now. One does not, after a time. But did you ever see him? He is in Highbury every now and then, and is sure to ride through every week in his way to Kingston. He has passed you very often. That may be, and I may have seen him 50 times, but without having any idea of his name. A young farmer, whether on horseback or on foot, is the very last sort of person to raise my curiosity. Humanity are precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. A degree or two to lower and credible opinions might interest me. I might hope to be useful to their families in some way or other, but a farmer can need none of my help, and is therefore in any sense as much above my notice as in every other case below it. To be sure, oh yes, it is not likely you should ever have observed him, but he knows you very well indeed. I mean, by sight. I have no doubt of his being a very respectable young man. I know indeed that he is so wellness that is him well. What do you imagine he is to be? I was 4 and 20, the 8th of the last June, and my birthday is the 3rd, just a fortnight and days different, which is very odd. Only 4 and 20? That is too young to settle. His mother is perfectly right not to be in a hurry. They seem very comfortable as they are, and if she were to take any pains to marry him, she would probably repent it. 6 years hence, if he could meet with a good sort of young woman in the same rank as his own, with a little money, it might be very desirable. And it was 6 years hence. Dear Miss Woodhouse, he would be 30 years old. Well, and that is an early as most men can afford to make, who are not born to an independence. Mr. Martin, I imagine, has his fortune entirely to make. I cannot be at all for beforehand with the world. Whatever money he might come to when his father died, whatever his share of his family property, it is, I dare say, all float or employed in his stock and so forth. And though with diligences and good luck, he may be rich in time, it is next to impossible that he should have realized anything yet. To be sure, so it is, but they live very comfortable. They have no indoors man, and else they do not want anything. And Mrs. Martin talk of tagging a boy another year. I wish you may not get into a scrap. Yet, whenever he does marry, I mean, as to being acquainted with his wife, for though his sisters from a superior educations are not to be altogether objected to, it does not follow that he might marry anybody at all fit for you to notice. There is the misfortune of your birth ought to make you particularly careful as to your associations. There can be no doubt of your being a gentleman's daughter, and you must support your claim to that situation by everything within your own power, or there will be plenty of people who would take pleasure in degrading you. Yes, to be sure, I suppose there are. But while I visit at Hartfield, and you're so kind to me, Miss Woodhouse, I'm not afraid of what anybody can say. You understand the force of influence pretty well, Harriet. But I would have you so firmly established in good society as to an independence, even of a Hartfield and Miss Woodhouse. I want to see you permanently well connected, and to that end, it will be advisable to have as few old acquaintances as may. And therefore, I said that if you should still be in this country when Mrs. Martin marries, I wish you may not be drawn in by your intimacy with the sisters to be acquainted with his wife, who will probably be some mere farmer's daughter without educations. To be sure, yes. Not that I think Mr. Martin would ever marry anybody but what had had some educations and been very well brought up. However, I do not mean to say it up on my opinion against yours. I and I am sure I shall not wish for the acquaintance of his wife. I shall always have a great regard for the Miss Martins, especially Elizabeth, and should be very sorry to give them up, for they are quite as well educated as me. But if he marries a lady, irrelevant, vulgar woman, certainly I had better not visit her if I can help it. Emma watched her through the fluctuations of the speech and saw no alarming symptoms of love. The young man had been the first admirer, but she trusted there was no other hold and that there would be no serious difficulties on Harriet's side to oppose any friendly arrangements of her own. They met, they met Mr. Martin the very next day as they were walking on the Donwell Road. He was on foot, and after looking very respectfully at her, looked with the most unfriendly satisfaction at companion. Emma was not sorry to have such an opportunity of survey, and walking a few yards forward while they talked together, soon made a quick eye sufficiently acquainted with Mr. Robert Martin. His appearance was very neat, and he looked like a sensible young man. But his person had no other advantage, and when he came to be constructed with gentlemen, she thought he must lose all the ground he had gained in Harriet's inclination. Harriet was not insensible of men. She had voluntarily noticed her father's gentleness with admiration as well as wonder. Mr. Martin looked as if he did not know what the manner was. Only think of our happening to meet him. How very odd. It was quite a chance, he said, that he had not gone round by runners. He did not think we ever walked this road. He thought we walked toward Randalls most days. He has not been able to get the romance of the forest yet. He was so busy the last time he was at Kingston that he quite forget it. But he goes again tomorrow. So very odd we should happen to meet. Well, Miss Woodhouse is like what you expected. What do you think of him? Do you think him so very plain? Yeah, he is so very plain, undoubtedly, remarkably plain. But that is nothing compared with his entire want of geniality. I had no right to expect much, and I did not expect much. But I had no idea that he could be so very clownish, so totally without hair. I had imagined him, I confess, a degree or two nearly genitally. To be sure, said Mr. Harry in a mortified voice. He is not so gentle as real gentle. I think, Harriet, since your acquaintance with us, you have been repeatedly in the company of some such very real gentleman that you must yourself be struck with the difference in Mr. Martin. At Hartfield, you have had very good specimens of well educated, well bred men. I should be surprised if, after seeing them, you could be in company with Mr. Martin again without perceiving him to be a very inferior creature, and rather wondering at yourself for having ever thought him at all agreeable before. Do not you begin to feel that now, when not you struck, I am sure you must have been struck by his awkward look and abrupt manner, and the uncountlessness of a voice which I heard to be fully undemodulated as I stood here. Certainly, he is not like Mr. Knightley. He is not such a fine air and way of walking as Mr. Knightley. I see the difference plain enough. But Mr. Knightley is a so very fine man. Mr. Knightley is so remarkably good that it is not fair to compare Mr. Martin with him. You might not see one in 100 with a gentleman so plainly written as in Mr. Knightley. But he is not the only gentleman you have been lately used to. What say you to Mr. Ashton and Mr. Alton? Compare to Mr. Martin with either of them, compare their manner of carrying themselves, of walking, of speaking, of being silent, you must see the difference. Oh, yes, there is a great difference. But Mr. Weston is almost an old man. Mr. Weston must be between 40 and 50, which makes his good manners the more valuable. The older a person grows, Harriet, the more important it is that their manners should not be bad. The more glaring and disgusting and loudness or coarseness or awkwardness becomes, what is passable in youth and detestable in later age. Mr. Martin is now awkward and abrupt. That will he be at Mr. Weston's time of life. There is no saying in it. There is no saying in it, replied Harriet rather solemnly. But there may be very good guessing. He will be a completely gross, vulgar farmer, totally inattitude to appearances and thinking of nothing but profit and loss. Really, indeed, that will be very bad. How much his business engrossed him already is very plain from the circumstances of his forgetting to inquire for the book you recommended. He was quite till too full of the market to think of anything else, which is just as it should be for a thriving man. What has he to do with books? And I have no doubt that he will thrive and be a very rich man in time, and his being illiterate and coarse did not disturb us. I wonder he did not remember the book, was all Harriet's answer, and spoken with a degree of queer displeasure which Emma thought might be safely left to itself. She, therefore, said no more for some time. Her next beginning was, in one respect, perhaps Mr. Elton's manners are superior to Mr. Knightley's or Mr. Weston's. They have more gentleness. They might be more safely held up as a pattern. There is an openness, a quickness, almost a bluntness in Mr. Weston, which everybody likes in him because there is so much good humor with it, but that would not do be copied. Neither would Mr. Knightley's strong net, decided commanding sort of manner, though it suits him very well. His figure and look in situation in life seem to allow it. But if any young man were to set about copying him, he would not be sufferable. On the contrary, I think a young man might be very safely recommended to take Mr. Elton as a model. Mr. Elton is good humored, cheerful, obliging, and gentle. He seems to me to be grown particularly gentle of late. I do not know whether he has any desire of integration himself with either of us. Harriet by additional softness, but it strikes me that his manners are softer than they used to be. If he means anything, it must be to please you. Did not I tell you what he said of you the other day? She then repeated some warm personal praise which she had drawn from Mr. Eldon, and now did full justice. And Harriet blushed and smiled and said she had always thought of Mr. Elton very agreeable. Mr. Elton was the very person fixed on by Emma for drawing the young farmer out of Harry's head. She thought it would be an excellent match and only too palpably desirable, natural, and probable for her to have much merit in planning it. She feared it was what everybody else most think of and predict. It was not likely, however, that anybody should have equaled her in the depth of the plan as it had entered her brain during the very first evening of Harry's coming to Hartfield. The longer she considered it, the greater was her sense of experience. Mr. Welton's situation was most suitable, quite the gentleman himself, and without law connections at the same time. Not of any family that could fairly object to the doubtful worth of Harriet. He had a comfortable home for her, and Emma imagined a very sufficient income, for though the vicarage of Highbury was not large, he was known to have some independent properties, and she thought very highly of him as a good humored, well meaning, respectable young man without any deficiency of useful understanding or knowledge of the world. She had already satisfied herself that he thought Harriet a beautiful girl, which she trusted with such frequent meetings at Hartwell was foundation enough on his side. And on Harriet's there could be little doubt that the idea of being preferred by him would have all the usual weight and efficiency, and he was really a very pleasing young man. A young man whom any woman not fastidious might like. He was reckoned very handsome, his person much admired in general, though not by her, there being a want of elegance of feature which she could not dispense with. But the girl who could be gratified by a Robert Martin sighing about the country to get walnuts for her might very well be conquered by Mr. Elton's advertisements. So, guys, here I end chapter 4, and next time I will start with chapter 5. So, thank you all of you for joining here. Nimesh Bastula, Nubriders Heikiran, Dr. Priya. Thank you. Varun Joshi, Sin Parikalpana. Full donation. Thank you. Vaibhav, Jamie Sugla, 8 to 400. Yes.